All right, this is the last chapter, chapter 25, the reproductive system. So there are 3 chapters on the final. There's chapter 23, the digestive system, chapter 24, the urinary system, and now chapter 25, the reproductive system. The reproductive system is separated into primary sex organs and accessory sex organs. The primary sex organs are those organs that are making the gametes, and gametes are sex cells. They're cells for fertilization. For males, it is the sperm cell. So the primary sex organ in males are the testes. For females, the gamete is the egg cell. So the egg cells come from the ovaries. So those are the primary sex organs for females. Everything else are accessory sex organs. We'll go over those, like the glands that produce secretions, and then external genitalia. The purpose of the reproductive system is to produce gametes, which are the sex cells for fertilization, and to have a method to get those sex cells together, and then fertilization has to occur. You're creating a progeny. You're creating, children. All right, I'll start with the male reproductive system, and then we'll finish with the female reproductive system. So we'll start with some external genitalia for the males. We're going to start with the scrotum. The scrotum is actually a fleshy sac, if you will, and it houses the gonads. It surrounds the testes. The reason why the testes are outside of the body cavity is because the optimal temperature to make the most sperm cells is about 3 degrees cooler than body temperature. So around 96 to 95 degrees is the optimal temperature to make the most sperm cells. So they're outside of the cavity. So there are mechanisms in place to help keep the temperature of the testes around 95 to 96 degrees. If they get too cool, there are mechanisms in place to bring the testes closer to the body cavity so they can warm up, so to speak. And if they get too warm, then there are mechanisms that they can drop away further from the body cavity so they can cool off. There are 2 muscles associated with the scrotum. First, there's the dartos muscle. The dartos muscle is actually a part of the wall of the scrotum. It usually has a wrinkled appearance to it. Whenever the dartos muscle contracts, it tightens up the scrotum and it lifts the testes closer to the body cavity so that they can receive more body warmth. Or the dartos muscle can relax and then allow for the testes to drop further away from the body cavity. And then there's a cremaster muscle. The cremaster muscle surrounds a cord called the spermatic cord, and then they surround each testes separately. There's a picture of it later. So the cremaster muscle is going to have the same principle as the dartos muscle, except it's not a part of the actual scrotum. The cremaster muscle is going to be a band of muscle that surrounds the spermatic cord and the testes. Now, just for reference, the spermatic cord is a cord that goes into the scrotum, and it contains blood vessels, nerves, and also a duct called the vas deferens. And the vas deferens is going to transport sperm cells to the ejaculatory duct during intercourse. All right, let's review some of the anatomy of the male reproductive system. What we were just talking about was the scrotum. So here's the scrotum. This is that fleshy pouch that hangs outside of the body cavity. The muscle inside here is the dartos muscle. We'll see that in the next picture. Inside of the scrotum, we have the male gonad, also known as the primary sex organ for males. Sperm cells are made inside of the testes, plus testosterone is made by cells inside of the testes as well. There is a comma-shaped organ on the back side, posterior surface of the testes, and that is called the epididymis. This is where sperm cells go to mature. We'll go over all this again when we go through the PowerPoint. And then we have the vas deferens, also known as the ductus deferens. They are the same thing. The vas deferens, the ductus deferens, transport sperm cells around the pubic bone, then around the bladder, and then it leads to a duct called the ejaculatory duct. This is a vesicle. There is a gland here called the seminal vesicle. It produces fluid called seminal fluid. There is a gland underneath the bladder. This is the prostate. We looked at this in the urinary system. The urethra, which goes from the bladder, goes through the prostate. So the ejaculatory duct, which is the duct that gathers all the secretions that can become part of semen, which is going to be the ejaculate, is going to be found inside of the prostate. All right, then we have a gland right here called the bulbourethral gland, also known as the Cowper's gland, and it produces a lubricating secretion for the urethra. We'll go over that when we get to it. And then we have the penis, which is probably the most recognized of the male reproductive system. The penis starts inside of the cavity in a part called the root, and then it goes outside, in the shaft, and then there's a head of the penis called the glans penis. The penis is made of erectile tissue. The erectile tissue, there's two types. There's corpus cavernosum, corpus spongiosum. We'll go over this again later. There are two cylinders of corpus cavernosum. They're on the dorsal surface of the penis. This is the dorsal surface of the penis, which is the surface you see when it's in its flaccid state. This side of the penis is the ventral surface of the penis, the front side, which is the side you're going to see when it's erect. All right, then remember we had the urethra. The urethra will transport sperm cells from the ejaculatory duct through the prostatic urethra, through the membranous urethra, and then through the spongy penile urethra until they're expelled out. There is a piece of tissue on the outside of the gland, and it's called the prepuce. This is also known as the foreskin, and this is the part that's removed during a circumcision. All right, now we can see some of the structures a little clearer inside of the scrotum. So here's the scrotum, the tissue on the outside. The muscle of the scrotum, this is the dartos muscle right here. You'll see that there is a wall that separates the two testes inside of the scrotum. So they're not just like two marbles in a sack. There actually is a dividing wall between the two of them right here, between the right and left testes. This is the cremaster muscle. It surrounds the spermatic cord. So this is the spermatic cord I was mentioning earlier. It has the vas deferens inside of it, has blood vessels inside of it, and the testicular nerve inside of it. It goes in towards the testes. So this is all surrounded by the cremaster muscle. So whenever this cremaster muscle contracts, it lifts the testes up closer to the body cavity. A little bit of trivia. The testes do not hang at equal length. One is going to be lower than the other. Typically, it's going to be the left testicle hangs lower than the right testicle. And that is because when you're walking, the two testicles will then just miss each other instead of bumping into each other. All right, now we can see the shaft of the penis. This is the shaft of the penis. And then now we can see the prepuce right here, which is the foreskin that surrounds the glans penis, which is the head of the penis. Now we're talking about the testes, the gonads, the primary sex organs, and I'm going to talk about a few things and highlight a few things. Inside of the testes, if you were to cut into one of the testicles, you would find that there's a whole bunch of highly coiled tubes known as seminiferous tubules. The seminiferous tubules are where sperm cells are made. There are stem cells inside of the seminiferous tubules that are called spermatogonia. And then the spermatogonia are going to divide and multiply and become spermatids, which then eventually become sperm cells. So sperm cells are made inside of the seminiferous tubules. Then those sperm cells are transported to the epididymis. And the epididymis is that comma-shaped structure on the posterior surface of the testicle. The epididymis is where sperm cells are going to mature. If they're going to be ejaculated during intercourse, then that's where they will leave the epididymis and be transported to the ejaculatory duct. If they're not going to be ejaculated after so long, they become too old, and then they will be broken down. So this is a picture showing the inside of the testes. Here are the seminiferous tubules inside of the lobule inside of the testes. This is where the sperm cells are made. Then they're transported into the epididymis, where they're going to wait here and mature. If they're going to be transported out of the epididymis, then they will go out through this next duct, which is known as the ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens. If you remember from your basic biology class, the sperm cell is the only human cell that has a flagellum, and a flagellum is a tail-like projection. The flagellum is going to whip around and become motile. So the sperm cells are the only cell that actually can move itself. The sperm cells do not actually become mobile or motile. The flagella is not going to be activated until after they've been ejaculated, and even then it's not until 30 minutes after ejaculation. This picture is showing a microscopic picture of a transverse section through the seminiferous tubule. So all of this right here is the seminiferous tubule. The cells that are closest to the seminiferous tubule, these are their spermatogonia cells. These are the primordial sperm cells that eventually become sperm cells. These cells right here are going to divide. These cells have the normal number of chromosomes. They have 46 chromosomes, which is what all the other somatic, normal body cells have. 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. These cells will divide by mitosis. And as a review, mitosis is the cell division where you get two identical daughter cells. So one of these cells will divide and become another spermatogonia cell. But some of these cells, after they divide, they start moving up the line. They get closer to the lumen. The lumen is the opening where the sperm cells are going to eventually end up. These spermatogonia cells start dividing by meiosis or meiosis, however you pronounce it. I pronounce it meiosis. Meiosis is cell division, but instead of getting an identical daughter cell, you get the gametes, the sperm cells. One spermatogonia cell will eventually become 4 spermatids, which then become 4 sperm cells. And whenever they start dividing by meiosis, the whole purpose of meiosis is to take the normal number of chromosomes and cut them in half. The sperm cells cannot have 46 chromosomes because when they meet with the egg cell, if the egg cell has 46 chromosomes, it's going to give you 92, which is too many chromosomes for humans. We only need 46. So the sperm cell is only going to have 23 chromosomes. The egg cell will only have 23 chromosomes, so that whenever the egg cell is fertilized by the sperm cell, the zygote, which is a fertilized egg, will have 46 chromosomes. The main blood supply to the testes that I want to talk about here are the testicular arteries and a series of veins called the pampiniform plexus. The testicular arteries are bringing oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood into the testes. The thing is, the blood that's coming through the testicular arteries is at body temperature, which is 98.6, which is too hot for sperm production. So there has to be a way to cool down the blood coming through the testicular artery, and that's where the pampiniform plexus comes into play. The pampiniform plexus, if you want to refer back to the picture, is a series of veins that surround the testicular artery. So, as the testicular artery is transporting blood down into the scrotum, the pampiniform plexus is bringing blood out of the scrotum, and it transfers the heat. The heat is transferred from the testicular artery into the pampiniform plexus, so that the blood that's traveling through the testicular artery, by the time it reaches the testicle, it is cooler. It is about 3 degrees cooler, which is the temperature needed to make sperm cells. All right, looking at the seminiferous tubules a little closer, there are 2 types of cells located inside of the seminiferous tubules. First are the spermatogenic cells. We talked about that a couple slides ago. These are the cells that eventually become the sperm cells. But there's also some other cells called columnar sustenocytes. Now there's another name for sustenocytes. They're also known as sustenacular cells. So sustenacular. The sustenacular cells. The term sustenacular is actually more common than sustenocyte. But if there's a question on the test about the sustenacular cell, then they call it the sustenocyte cell. So don't mix up the two. But the sustenacular cells provide sustenance for the sperm cells. They help provide fructose, which is the sugar that is preferred by the sperm cells for nourishment. And then it also separates the sperm cells from your blood supply. They create something called the BTB, which stands for blood testis barrier or blood testis border. So remember, in the brain, we had the blood-brain barrier, which kept the blood from leaking out into the brain tissues. Well, now we have to separate the sperm cells from your blood, because inside of blood is white blood cells. And white blood cells are going to do what they're going to do, which is break down anything that's not considered a part of you. Since sperm cells only have 23 chromosomes, your white blood cells aren't going to know the difference between sperm cells and your regular cells, and it will try to destroy them. So we're separating the sperm cells from your blood using the sustenacular cells, or the sustenocytes, which create the blood testis barrier. All right, here's a slide saying some of the things I said earlier, in case you didn't catch it. Spermatogenic cells, those are the stem cells that will produce sperm cells eventually. Look at this. There are 400 million sperm cells formed per day. You don't use them every day, as far as I know. But so those that you don't use that are too old will then be broken down. Some of the parts can be recycled, but the rest of it will just be broken down for the individual amino acids. Sperm cell production begins at puberty. Now, some of the spermatogonia cells, the stem cells, are produced in utero. So before you're born, the seminiferous tubules already have the spermatogenic cells, but they're not going to start producing sperm cells until you reach puberty. Now, from the time it's made by the seminiferous tubule and matured inside of the epididymis, it takes about 75 days for that to happen. All right, so spermatogonia cells, they go through meiosis, dividing. One spermatogonia cell will provide or make 4 spermatids. So one spermatogonia produces 4 spermatid cells. And then the spermatid cell looks a lot different from the actual sperm cell. The spermatid cell looks like this, actually. Looks like a normal cell with a gigantic nucleus. The process of changing this cell into a sperm cell, which is going to look like this, is called spermiogenesis. So spermiogenesis, I'm going to try to spell it out for you right here. Sperm, E-O, and then I have to put a little hyphen here because I can't fill it all in one spot. Genesis. That is the process of changing from the spermatid to a sperm cell. It's called spermiogenesis, and that's what has to happen in the epididymis. That's why it has to mature. We have to change it. It's going to eject most of the cytoplasm. It's going to create a tail, the flagellum, and then it's also going to create a neck piece. The neck piece would be about right here. That separates the head of the sperm from the flagellum, and this neck piece is full of mitochondria because the mitochondria are going to produce ATP in order for the flagella to move. Now also on the very end of the sperm cell is something called the acrosome. The acrosome is a sac of digestive enzymes, and they stay inside of the acrosome until it reaches the sperm cell. There is a process called capacitation, and this is all in fertilization, which we don't really go into in anatomy. But capacitation is the process of eroding and wearing down the acrosome so that when the sperm cell reaches the egg cell, see, the egg cell has all kinds of defense mechanisms in place to prevent any type of invaders from invading it. It doesn't want the sperm cell. So the sperm cell has to find its way to the egg cell. So it has to burrow through the outer layers of cells until it reaches the singular egg cell, and it does so by using the sac of enzymes known as the acrosome. All right, so the sustentosites, the sustenacular cells, they surround the spermatic cells because they create the blood-testis barrier that I mentioned earlier. They also provide fructose for the spermatic cells, and plus they also will help and assist moving the sperm cells to the epididymis. It does so by secreting a fluid called testicular fluid. So this testicular fluid is going to circulate from the seminiferous tubules to the epididymis, and that will help create a current to transport the sperm cells to the epididymis. Now there are muscle-like cells that surround the seminiferous tubules. They're called myoid cells, and these myoid cells will also help create a current. It will contract and relax in order to help propel the sperm cells to the epididymis. The other cells associated with the scrotum, but they're not inside of the seminiferous tubules, are interstitial cells. Interstitial cells are found between the seminiferous tubules, and they secrete testosterone. So testosterone is the main male sex hormone. It comes from the interstitial cells. Testosterone, if you remember from the endocrine chapter, testosterone creates the secondary male sex characteristics, plus you have to have testosterone in order to make sperm cells. Now, the hormone that regulates the amount of testosterone being released is LH. LH is one of the gonadotropins that comes from the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary produces luteinizing hormone, which then travels to the interstitial cells. And if we increase the amount of luteinizing hormone, then that will increase the amount of testosterone that is being produced by the interstitial cells. I think we got the epididymis down. The epididymis is located behind the testes, and this is where sperm cells go to mature. And it takes about 20 days for sperm cells to get to the point where they're able to fertilize the egg. All right, the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens is also known as the vas deferens, Vasdeferens. Vas deferens is also known as the ductus deferens. And the purpose or the function is to store and transport sperm cells. It transports the sperm cells from the epididymis all the way around the pubic bone, behind the bladder, and into the ejaculatory duct. Now, the vas deferens is part of the spermatic cord. Now, you may have heard of a procedure called a vasectomy. A vasectomy is where they will clip and cut the vas deferens in order to prevent the sperm cells from transporting to the ejaculatory duct, so it renders the male sterile. So this is a sterilization process for males. They will cut the vas deferens, known as a vasectomy. All right, the spermatic cord, like I was mentioning earlier, it contains vessels. It contains the ductus deferens that we just talked about, plus the testicular blood vessels like the testicular artery and the pampiniform plexus. Plus, there's also some nerves. Now, the spermatic cord goes all the way down into the scrotum, and it goes through the inguinal canal. This is also a place where if the part of the intestine squeezes through the inguinal canal, that's called a hernia. We looked at it earlier, but we haven't really talked about it that much, I guess. This is the spermatic cord right here. Pampiniform plexus, we can see it, and then there's the testicular artery inside of that. It's surrounded by the cremaster muscle. Here's the ductus deferens, the vas deferens, as it goes around the pubic bone and then around the bladder to go into the ejaculatory duct, which is located inside of the prostate. All right, then we have the urethra. We talked about the urethra with the urinary system. The urethra is shared. It's a transport system to transport the sperm cells from the ejaculatory duct to the outside. But it's also used to convey urine from the bladder to the outside. So there's actually two different types of fluids. There's either semen or it is urine transported by the urethra. Now, the male urethra is longer than the female urethra because it has to go through the penis. So there are three parts to the male urethra. There's the prostatic urethra, goes through the prostate. Now, in the book, they call it the intermediate part of the urethra. And this is the part of the urethra that goes through the pelvic floor muscles. So it's also known as the membranous urethra. So membranous urethra is going to be the shortest part of the male urethra, and it's just through the pelvic floor muscles. And then we have the spongy urethra, also known as the penile urethra. It goes through the corpus spongiosum. This is going to be the longest part of the male urethra. All right, this is a different picture. Looking at it now, we can see the bladder right here. We can see the seminal vesicle right here. And then here's where the vas deferens enters into the ejaculatory duct. All right, so here's the prostate. This is the prostatic urethra. These are the pelvic floor muscles, so this is the membranous urethra. And here's the spongy urethra right here. It goes through the corpus spongiosum erectile tissue. Now, if you take the penis and cut it in half, in this type of cut right here, I swear to God, it looks like Kenny from South Park, but don't quote me on that. So right here, we can see the tissues inside of the penis. We can see the erectile tissues. There's corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. Corpus cavernosum is right here and right here. There's two cylinders of it, and it's on the dorsal surface of the penis. The smaller erectile tissue is right here, which is the corpus spongiosum, and that's what the urethra goes through, which is why it's called the spongy urethra. Now let's talk about some of the accessory glands. We have the seminal glands. The seminal glands are on the posterior surface of the bladder. The seminal glands produce a fluid called seminal fluid. So seminal fluid comes from seminal glands. Let's talk about the word semen. Semen is all of the secretions gathered together that are going to become part of the ejaculate. The semen is what is ejaculated to outside of the body. 60% of the semen is going to be seminal fluid, and it contains fructose, which is the sugar to nourish the sperm. Plus, there's going to be some enzymes that will enhance sperm motility. So there's going to be enzymes that are going to activate the flagella. These enzymes actually themselves do not become activated until about 30 minutes after ejaculation. There are some prostaglandins that are a part of the seminal fluid. Prostaglandins cause smooth muscle contraction. Now, some of the smooth muscle contractions in the male reproductive system so that we can help eject the sperm outside of the body. But the prostaglandins are not done yet. Once the prostaglandins are inside of the female reproductive tract, it also causes contractions, usually of the uterus or the vaginal canal. Now, there are enzymes in the seminal fluid that are going to clot the semen. After it's been ejaculated, it becomes real, well, no pun intended, but it becomes real stiff. It's so that it can stick to the inside of the female reproductive tract. It clots, so it doesn't just fall out, so you will, with gravity. But then, after about 30 minutes, the enzymes are activated to liquefy the semen so that the sperm cells can now swim up through the uterus and make its way towards the egg cell. Then we have the prostate. The prostate surrounds the prostatic urethra, plus it also has the ejaculatory duct. So the prostate produces a fluid called prostatic fluid, and it only is about 1/3 of the volume. So most of the volume of semen is going to be seminal fluid. The second most common component of semen is going to be prostatic fluid. And just like the seminal fluid, there are substances that are going to enhance sperm motility. That means they're going to activate the flagella. And then again, there's some enzymes in the prostate that will help clot the semen after ejaculation and then be able to liquefy the clot so that the sperm cells are then able to swim. There's another gland called the bulbourethral gland. It's also known as Cowper's gland. And it is below the prostate. It empties a secretion into the membranous urethra, which is the intermediate part of the urethra. Now, this secretion is a mucose type of secretion, but it's also a lubricant. It lubricates the urethra. It also lubricates the tip of the gland's penis to help with insertion. And then it is also alkaline, and alkaline means it's going to help buffer the acidic urine that's still left inside of the urethra. Remember, the urethra is shared between urine or semen. Now, the thing about semen is that it is slightly alkaline, and that's also going to help with the female reproductive tract because the female reproductive tract is acidic. So the alkalinity of the semen will help buffer the acidity of the female reproductive tract. Plus, if there's any urine left in the urethra, it'll help take care of that as well. All right, so the penis is the copulatory organ. It is designed to become erect and then be inserted into the vaginal canal and then to deposit the sperm cells or the semen into the female reproductive tract. So the penis is part of the external genitalia, even though some of it is inside of the pelvic cavity. So the part that you see on the outside that hangs on the outside is going to be the shaft of the penis. The very end of it is called the glans penis, also known as the head of the penis. It is all corpus spongiosum tissue. So the glans penis is corpus spongiosum tissue, and then the prepuce, which is the foreskin, and that is the part that is removed during a circumcision. Here we spell out the erectile tissues. One of them is the corpus spongiosum. That's on the ventral surface of the penis. It surrounds the urethra, which is why it's called the spongy urethra. And then there are two cylinders of the corpora cavernosum, or corpora cavernosa, either way. So that's the dorsal surface of the penis. That's what makes up most of the penis. Now, the autonomic nervous system, how does it affect the male reproductive system? Well, erections are under control of the parasympathetic nervous system. It will dilate the penile arteries and allow the erectile tissues to fill with blood. The sympathetic nervous system has to take over when it comes to ejaculation in order to eject the sperm cells and the semen out of the penis. All right, spermatogenesis. The term spermatogenesis, genesis means the formation of, spermato means sperm cells. So the term spermatogenesis means the formation of sperm cells. All right, the first thing you got to have are the primary spermatocytes, and they're from the spermatogonia, which are going to be the stem cells. Now, we're not going to go into specifics too much, except that there are two types of spermatocytes. There's type A and type B. The type A will always stay spermatogonia, and they're always going to have 46 chromosomes, and they're always going to divide by mitosis to produce more spermatogonia cells. But if they divide and become to the type B cells, those are the cells that are going to become the primary spermatocytes that go through meiosis. And any cell that goes through meiosis is going to halve the number of chromosomes. So we go from 46 chromosomes 223 chromosomes. And again, by the time we finish meiosis, we create 4 sperm cells from one spermatogonia cell, or from one spermatocyte. And that's basically what they're showing in this picture right here. Starting from one cell, it goes through meiosis. Remember, there's 2 different types. There's 2 phases of meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, if you remember that from your biology days. The last stage of spermatogenesis is spermiogenesis. And spermiogenesis, right here, that is the formation of the sperm cell. And that's where we take the spermatid, which basically looks like a round cell with a nucleus that almost takes up the entire cell, and then it makes it into a head. Then there's a midpiece, which is the neck, and then a tail. And the tail is going to be the flagellum, which is going to be the only motile part of the sperm cell. It whips around kind of like a whip, and then the sperm cell can then creep its way towards the egg cell. Well, it's right here. I didn't realize this picture was in here. It wasn't in the old edition of the PowerPoints. But anyway, so here we have the spermatid cells right here, and then it slowly changes, forms a tail, forms a midpiece. This midpiece is full of mitochondria that help propel the cell, or makes the flagella move around like a whip. And then here's the headpiece, plus this is the acrosome right here, which is that sac of enzymes that help break down the outer part of the egg cell in order to make it to the egg cell. All right, I mentioned this earlier, but here it is written out for you. The sustenocytes, the sustentacular cells, nourishment for the cells, for the sperm cells, and then they also provide the blood testis barrier to separate the sperm cells from your immune system. All right, other hormones associated with the male reproductive system, we have FSH. FSH comes from the anterior pituitary. It's called follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the spermatogonia cells to produce more sperm cells by mitosis and meiosis. So if we increase your FSH levels, then you increase your sperm cell count, or your sperm count. And then testosterone, we mentioned that earlier, that is the main male sex hormone. It is required to make sperm cells. All right, we also have androgen binding protein located inside of the seminiferous tubules. This androgen binding protein binds to testosterone. So testosterone has to cross through the barrier and get into the seminiferous tubule in order to bind to the androgen binding protein, which will then produce sperm cells. And then there's another hormone called inhibin. Inhibin is produced by the sustentacular cells, and it feeds back to the anterior pituitary and inhibits FSH, so that it will decrease spermatogenesis if needed. And then we have the female reproductive system. There are going to be some different parts with the female reproductive system, and to tell you the truth, when it comes to the females, they're a little more complicated, no pun intended. It is because they produce a few more hormones than we're used to, and plus, not only do they have to produce the gametes, which is the egg cell, they have to have a method of getting that egg cell to where it can be fertilized, and then they have to be able to transport that fertilized egg cell into the organ to house it in order to produce an embryo, which then produces a fetus. So you have to be able to house the fetus for 9 months or so, and then be able to give birth to it later. So there's a lot of things going on in the female reproductive system. All right, so they're gonna produce the gametes, which are gonna be the egg cells. They produced inside or outside. They're produced by the ovary, which is why the ovary is the primary sex organ, is the gonad. Every month, every female undergoes a cycle called the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle each month will build up the lining of the uterus. The uterus is the organ that houses the embryo. It has to produce a placenta. Placenta is where the fetus will get its nutrients from. It's where the mother's blood will take the nutrients, so it can be picked up by the female circulation. And then they have to be able to, part of the menstrual cycle then is to get rid of the lining if there's no pregnancy. So we'll get to that at the end of this chapter. We'll look at the ovaries, and then we'll look at tubes that transport the egg cell or the fertilized egg cell, which are the uterine tubes. And then we'll look at the uterus, which is the organ that houses the fetus, and then the vagina, which is the female copulatory organ, plus it's also the birth canal. We'll start with the ovaries. The ovaries are the gonads that are female gonads. They are the sex cell producing, the primary sex organ of the female reproductive system. There are two ovaries. There's one on the right, one on the left, and they're suspended by ligaments. These ligaments are going to help suspend the ovaries to the uterus or to the abdominal wall, either way. These ligaments are called the broad ligament, the suspensory ligament, and then the ovarian ligament. The broad ligament, the reason why it's called the broad ligament is because it looks like a blanket and it is a broad attachment. It surrounds the uterine tubes. This broad ligament surrounds the ovary and it surrounds the ovarian ligament all the way over to the uterus, and also it goes down around parts of the cervix and the vagina. So that's why it's broad. There are broad attachments. The suspensory ligament suspends the ovary from the abdominal wall. And then the ovarian ligament is between the ovary and the uterus. Now, the ovarian ligament is just a ligament, it's not hollow, so no egg cell is going to be transported along the ovarian ligament. The ovary is separated into an ovarian cortex and then an ovarian medulla. The cortex being in the outside, the medulla being in the inside. The inside of the ovary, the medulla, that's where we have blood vessels, we have lymph vessels and nerves that lead into the ovary. The outer part, the cortex, is full of follicles, and follicles are those cells that surround the oocyte. Oocytes are the egg cells. So the egg cells are surrounded by follicular cells, and these follicular cells are producing hormones like estrogen and progesterone, but that's going to be in the ovarian cortex. It's the ovarian cortex that's going to develop the egg cell. Egg cell will be matured, and then it's going to erupt from the ovarian cortex in a process called ovulation. So this is showing a microscopic picture of the ovary with the developing egg cells around in the cortex. We're going to look at a picture later that's a little clearer, and it's just an artist's drawing. And then we have the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes is a transportation tube that extends from the uterus out towards the ovary. So it has to receive the egg cell, and it has to provide a place for the egg cell to wait to see if it's going to be fertilized. And then it has to transport that cell, whether it's fertilized or not, into the lumen of the uterus to be housed or to be sloughed off if there's no pregnancy. But anyway, the parts of the uterine tube include the infundibulum. This is the most distal end of the uterine tube. The uterine tube is also known as the fallopian tube. You may have heard that term before. So fallopian tubes, uterine tubes. It's also known as the oviduct, O-V-I-D-U-C-T. Either way. So the uterine tube parts include the infundibulum. This is the most distal end of the uterine tube, which means this is the end that's closest to the ovary. There are finger-like projections that brush over the surface of the ovary and is known as fimbriae. So fimbriae are like fingers, and these fingers brush over the surface of the ovary. Now, at times of ovulation, whenever the egg cell erupts from the ovarian cortex, the fimbriae actually brush over the surface of the ovary in beat or in timing with your heartbeat, so that it helps create a circulation so that it can collect the egg cell, and the egg cell can then go inside of the uterine tube. It's not perfect though. Sometimes the egg cell will not make it into the uterine tube and it just drops to the floor of the pelvis, and then eventually it'll just be disintegrated. So the infundibulum is the most distal end of the uterine tube, surrounded by the fimbriae. The middle part's called the ampulla. The ampulla is the part where is the site for fertilization. So the egg cell, once it's been ovulated, is collected by the fimbriae into the uterine tube. It's going to hang out in the ampulla to see if it's going to be fertilized. Now, it could take up to 12 to 48 hours for it to be inside the ampulla before it moves on. Once it moves on, then chances of fertilization are going to be slim to none. And then we have the isthmus. The isthmus is the last part of the uterine tube before it joins into the uterus. The isthmus is really thin, and sometimes the fertilized egg will implant in the isthmus instead of inside of the uterine tube. If a pregnancy has occurred and implantation occurs anywhere then inside of the uterus, it's called an ectopic pregnancy. And ectopic pregnancies are not going to be viable. One of the most common places for an ectopic pregnancy is the uterine tube. It's going to be at the isthmus. All right, so now we can see the ovary right here suspended by the suspensory ligament from the abdominal wall. And then we have the ovarian ligament between the ovary and the uterus. And then all this blanket right here, that's all part of the broad ligament. Here's the uterine tube. This is going to be the infundibulum of the uterine tube with the fimbriae which extend over the surface of the ovary. This is the ampulla, and then we have the isthmus of the uterus. Of the uterine tube. We can see the opening inside here. Here's the ampulla, and here's the isthmus, where it's real thin and tight. And then the egg cell will be inside of the lumen of the uterus, or the fertilized egg cell. If it's been fertilized, it's going to implant in the endometrial lining of the uterus. So the uterus is the organ that houses the fetus. This is the organ that's going to propel the fetus through the vaginal canal for childbirth. So each month, the uterus, the inside lining, the uterine lining, is going to prepare for pregnancy. It gets real thick and it gets real plush, or lush, I should say, and it's real sugary. And that's the perfect environment for implantation. So if pregnancy occurs, then the fertilized egg can then implant itself in the endometrial lining and create a placenta, and then the embryo can develop from there. But if pregnancy did not occur, then the lining is going to be sloughed off each month, and then it'll rebuild, prepare for maybe pregnancy for the next month. The way the uterus lies, they call it an anteverted position. That because it lays over towards the anterior surface. It actually lays on top of the bladder. Parts of the uterus include, there's a fundus, which is the dome part on the very top. The neck of the uterus is called the cervix, and the cervix is the opening into the uterus. There's an external opening and an internal opening. The external opening is the one that's closest to the vaginal canal. These are the cervical cells that they're collected during a test called a pap smear, and then they'll look at these cells, see if they're typical or atypical. If they're atypical, then it's possible that there's some sort of cancer process going on. All right, so here's the uterus. It is a pear-shaped organ. This is the anteverted position I was talking about. It lays towards the front on top of the bladder. Here's the fundus of the uterus. It's the dome part on the top. The main part is the body of the cervix, and then, body of the uterus. And then here's the cervix. Here's the external opening, the external os. Here's the internal opening, the internal os. So this is the uterus. You see that the cervix does sit inside of the vaginal canal. Just a little bit of trivia, and we'll talk about this when we get to physiology. But one of the things that happens during intercourse is that the uterus will then become more erect. It actually lays out towards the rectum, and that's so that it will receive part of the semen that's coming from the penis. The next slide talks about the different types of ligaments associated with the uterus, but we're going to skip over that and go straight to the tissues of the uterus. The tissues of the uterus, we have 3 layers of tissues. There's the perimetrium, the myometrium, and then we have the endometrium. The perimetrium is the most superficial layer, so it's the outer tissues of the uterus. It has a epithelium on the very outside edge of it, which is going to be the visceral peritoneum. So the perimetrium is the serous layer. It's on the outer part. The myometrium is the muscle. So it's going to be smooth muscle. There are some hormones that affect this smooth muscle, and one of those is oxytocin, if you remember that from the endocrine chapter. Oxytocin comes from the posterior pituitary, and it travels to the uterus, and it makes the smooth muscle contract. It'll do that during the menstrual cycle in order to help slough off the inner lining, but it also is used in childbirth as well. Anyway, then the inner lining is the endometrium. This is this part that lines the lumen, the internal cavity of the uterus. It is the endometrium that builds up each month, preparing itself for implantation, or it is sloughed off if there is no pregnancy. There are 2 layers to the endometrium. There's a functional layer, and then there's a basal layer, and you have to know the difference between the 2. The basal layer is never sloughed off. I probably could have written that better. Anyway, it's never sloughed off. It always stays close to the myometrium. But the basal layer has a layer on top of it called the functional layer. And the functional layer is built up each month. Well, anyway, it does build up each month, and it prepares itself for pregnancy. It gets real secretory, means there's a lot of secretion, there's a lot of glycogen that's built up. The arteries, the spiral arteries, will multiply, so there's a lot of blood supply going to the functional layer, and that is because it is going to produce or make the placenta if there is implantation. The only thing I'm going to mention about the arteries of the uterus is that in the radial arteries there are straight arteries and there are spiral arteries. So the straight arteries go to the basal layer of the endometrium. Spiral arteries go to the functional layer, which means the spiral arteries are the ones that are going to proliferate during the menstrual cycle to prepare for implantation. And it's these spiral arteries that will be degenerated and slough off that tissue during the menstrual cycle if there has been no implantation. It starts the menses. So in the endometrium, here is the basal layer right here, which always stays right here. And then up here is the functional layer that will either become real thick during the menstrual cycle or then be sloughed off during menses. Then we have the vagina. The vagina is basically a muscular tube. It has to receive the erect penis during intercourse. It has to be able to receive the semen that's been ejaculated. And then it has to also provide a way for the birth, so for the birth canal. The outer tissues of the vagina is an adventitia, so that the vaginal canal doesn't move around too much. Then there's a layer of smooth muscle in the middle, and then there's a mucosa that's on the inside. And this mucosa is lined with stratified squamous epithelium, which makes sense because any opening to the outside is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Now this is non-keratinized because it has to stay moist. There is a structure called a hymen, and it is a piece of tissue that covers the opening into the vaginal canal. Now this piece of tissue is usually ruptured and destroyed the first time the female has intercourse. But I just want to point out that just because there's an absence of the hymen does not mean that she has had intercourse before. Sometimes there are certain sports and extreme sports that will rupture the hymen. And then we have parts of the female external genitalia. The part that lies over the pubic symphysis is called the mons pubis, and this is an area that actually has a layer of fat between the pubic symphysis and the outer part of the skin, and then this is also where pubic hair starts to grow during puberty. And then there are folds of tissue, and they're called labia. There's labia majora and labia minora, and some of these female and male external genitalia and even internal genitalia are the same. They're called homologous organs. The reason why they're called homologous organs is because they have a similar origin. For example, we have the labia majora, which are the folds of tissue that covers all of the openings. It covers the openings to the vaginal canal, and it actually covers the opening also to the urethra. But the labia majora is the same thing as the scrotum. They have the same origin, and we'll go over that in physiology actually when we start talking about embryology and the development of the embryo. But up to about 7 weeks, you cannot differentiate between a female and a male embryo. The presence of the Y chromosome is going to determine whether this embryo develops into a male. In the absence of a Y chromosome, then it develops into a female embryo. So, but before that, there's a piece of tissue that's either going to become the scrotum or the labia majora. So if they have the Y chromosome, it turns into a scrotum. If they do not have the Y chromosome, then it becomes the labia majora. So the labia majora and the male scrotum are homologous organs, and I think I mentioned that in the exam study guide. Make sure you know the homologous organs. Now the labia majora has a flesh color to it. Lying inside of the labia majora is another folded tissue called the labia minora. And the labia minora covers a piece of erectile tissue called the clitoris. So the labia minora is the female homologue to the male prepuce, which is going to be the foreskin. So that means that the prepuce and the labia minora have similar origins. If there's a Y chromosome, then this tissue turns into the prepuce. If there is no Y chromosome, then it turns into the labia minora. The labia minora is more vascular than the labia majora, which is why it has a more pink color to it than the labia majora. There is erectile tissue in the female reproductive system. We're so used to hearing about the male erectile tissue in the penis, but actually the female reproductive system also has erectile tissue, is known as the clitoris. The clitoris actually lies right in front of the pubic bone. The clitoris is surrounded by a bunch of nerve endings, so it's real sensitive. So then during intercourse, the clitoris will become engorged with blood just like the penis does. And then whenever the male and female are together for intercourse and their pubic bones come into close contact with each other, it actually pushes down on the clitoris and it gives it a pleasurable feeling. So this is looking at the external genitalia of the female reproductive system and looking at the perineum. Here we have the labia majora on the outside, covers everything, just like the scrotum covers everything on the outside of the male reproductive system. And then the inside here is the labia minora, right here. And it forms this hood over the erectile tissue in the female reproductive system, which is the clitoris. We can see the opening to the urethra. Here's the external urethral opening. And then right here is the opening to the vaginal canal. So this is the vaginal orifice right here. This is where the erect penis will go. A little bit of trivia. If you ever want to hear some weird stories about the male and female reproductive system, you should probably talk to a urologist. They have some crazy stories. I know a urologist who told a story once of a female patient coming in that couldn't get pregnant. Come to find out, instead of having sex through the vaginal orifice, they were having sex through the urethral orifice, and it just wasn't working out for them. Now, when it comes to oogenesis and the female menstrual cycle, we'll go over some basic steps on this PowerPoint, but we'll go into depth more when we get into physiology. Remember, we have the gonadotropins that come from the anterior pituitary. One of them is known as LH. LH in males would stimulate testosterone production. LH in females will elevate estrogen production. Now, the hormones are produced by the follicular cells that surround the egg cell. Now, just like in the male reproductive system, we had spermatogonia that are sperm cells that are stem cells for sperm cells. We also have primordial egg cells known as oogonia. And these oogonia will mature and become egg cells eventually. So the egg cells are stimulated by FSH. So FSH, that comes from the anterior pituitary, travels to the ovaries and stimulates the growth and maturity of the egg cells. Now, just like in males, the spermatogonia produce sperm cells. What makes it different for females is that one oogonia cell, as it divides and goes through meiosis, it does produce 4 cells, but only one of them is a viable cell, which is going to be the egg cell. The other 3 cells that are produced are called polar bodies, and they're not going to be viable at all, and they're going to degenerate. When it comes to meiosis and meiosis of the egg cells, they stop halfway through the meiosis 1 stage. If it's fertilized, then it continues on through meiosis 2 to form the zygote. Every month, females go through a monthly menstrual cycle. It starts at puberty, then it ends with menopause. After menopause, there are no more monthly menstrual cycles. But during the menstrual cycle, there are processes in place to prepare the uterus for pregnancy and processes in place to develop the egg cell. There are 2 different phases of the menstrual cycle. There's the ovarian cycle, because it has everything to do with the ovary, and then there's the uterine cycle, which has everything to do with the uterus. During the ovarian cycle, that is the process of maturing an egg cell, ovulation of the egg cell, and then the cells that are left behind that produce the hormone progesterone in order to affect the uterus in case there's been a pregnancy. And then the uterine cycle is everything that happens to the endometrium of the uterus. It builds up. It's waiting to see if there's been implantation, and then it's sloughed off if not, and then it does the whole thing over again. All right, in a nutshell, the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle, there's the follicular phase. The follicular phase takes up to about 14 days, and it varies from woman to woman, but on average, for about the first 14 days is called the follicular phase. And this is the phase that develops the follicles that surround the egg cell. And these follicular cells produce estrogen and progesterone in order to develop this egg cell that's going to be ovulated. After 14 days, we have ovulation. That is the process of erupting the egg cell from the ovarian cortex so that it can be collected by the fimbriae of the uterine tubes. And then after that, the cells that are left behind, the follicular cells, become something called a corpus luteum. So that starts the luteal phase. The corpus luteum produces copious amounts of progesterone, and progesterone is the hormone that's building up the endometrium of the uterus. So the more progesterone that's produced, the thicker the lining of the uterus for implantation. At the end, so the first 14 days are the follicular phase. Ovulation is day 14, and then days 14 through 28 correspond to the luteal phase. If there's been pregnancy and there's been implantation and a placenta is formed, the placenta produces a hormone known as HCG, which is the pregnancy hormone. HCG feeds back to the corpus luteum, and it keeps the corpus luteum viable, so that it keeps producing progesterone. It keeps producing progesterone for about 9 months. The more progesterone is produced, the placenta stays where it is and the fetus will develop. After 9 months, the placenta ages and it stops producing HCG, which is the pregnancy hormone, and those levels drop. Once those levels drop, then the corpus luteum dries up and stops producing progesterone, and then childbirth starts. All right, so the first half of the ovarian cycle is the follicular phase, and that is because the follicles that surround the egg cell are in control. These follicles are going to be developed because of FSH. FSH, the follicle-stimulating hormone, develops the follicles. Now, FSH is not going to target just one follicle with oocyte. It will target a whole bunch of them at once. This whole group of egg cells that start to develop is called a cohort. Now, eventually, at the end of the first 14 days, there's only going to be one main follicle with one egg cell that's going to be viable. The rest, it's like a race. If you don't come in first, you come in last, and they're not going to be used at all, and they'll degenerate. Now, every so often, 2 egg cells will be ovulated. We've heard this before, and that's how we get some twins sometimes. And they are going to be fraternal twins, which means they will not be identical because they're 2 separate egg cells. So they could both be fertilized, which is how the fraternal twins come about. Anyway, so the first half of the ovarian cycle is the follicular phase, and we help develop one egg cell surrounded by the follicular cells that are going to be producing progesterone and estrogen. During the last part of the follicular phase, there is a fluid-filled cavity that is formed called an antrum. And we're going to have pictures of this later. But this antrum that develops and fills with follicular fluid. And this follicular fluid gets to be so much that it's going to force the egg cell to the very edge of the follicle cells. And then eventually, it's going to lead to ovulation. The fluid's going to push the egg cell out. And that's what ovulation is. There are a layer of cells that surround the egg cell. It's called corona radiata. And these are the cells that are like guard cells to prevent pregnancy from happening. That's why the sperm cell has a sac of enzymes called the acrosome. The acrosome, once it breaks open, will digest the corona radiata so that the sperm cell can make it to the egg cell. And then we have ovulation around day 14. That is when the egg cell erupts from the antrum, and all that fluid pushes out into the abdominal cavity. Hopefully, the fimbriae that are circulating around the ovary will create a circulation and allow that egg cell to go into the uterine tube. The signal for ovulation is LH. LH will surge and peak. That's why they call LH the ovulation hormone. If you're taking a test for ovulation predictor tests, then they're testing your LH levels to see if they're going to spike. Plus also, right before ovulation, your temperature will spike, your basal temperature spikes. So after ovulation, the next phase of the ovarian cycle is the luteal phase. They call it the luteal phase because the follicular cells that are left behind form a structure called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum produces a lot of progesterone. And progesterone builds up the endometrial lining, the functional layer of the endometrium, to prepare for pregnancy or for implantation. If there is no implantation, then the corpus luteum degenerates. They say here it dies and becomes what is known as a corpus albicans. Corpus albicans, albican means white, so it forms a white body, which is like a scar tissue. All right, so this is showing you the different stage of the ovarian cycle and developing the egg cell. So a whole cohort of primordial egg cells and follicles will start to develop, but only one of them will win the race. As it matures, it develops this antrum, which is going to be filled with follicular fluid, and then it's going to push that egg cell to the very edge, which is what they're showing right here. And then at day 14, with the surge of LH, then it erupts from the ovarian cortex. So this is ovulation, showing you the egg cells being pushed out, plus the follicular fluid. Then hopefully it's collected by the fimbriae into the uterine tube. And then these follicular cells that are left behind right here form the corpus luteum, and they're heavy deposits of lipids are associated with corpus luteum, which is why they've colored it yellow. So this is producing progesterone, which is the cholesterol-based hormone. So this is the fully functional corpus luteum producing progesterone. If no pregnancy, then it shrivels up and dies and becomes the corpus albicans. This is just showing you the surge of LH that happens at around day 14 that indicates ovulation. All right, this is just laying it out. We just looked at the other picture. We have the developing follicles, and then eventually there's going to be one main follicle with the egg cell, and then we have ovulation pushing that egg cell. Here's the corona radiata that surrounds that egg cell. The follicular cells left behind form the corpus luteum, and then towards the end of the 14 days of the luteal phase, no pregnancy, it dies and becomes the corpus albicans. This is showing you how estrogen and progesterone levels change during the ovarian cycle. First, estrogen levels will rise, and then when estrogen levels rise, that's because the LH levels rise, the LH peaks, and that shows ovulation. So what happens after ovulation? And then estrogen levels will drop, and then progesterone levels are rising. So why are progesterone levels rising? It is because of the corpus luteum producing all kinds of progesterone. And then no implantation, progesterone levels drop because the corpus luteum is dying, and then this signals the start of the menstrual cycle with menses, and the inner lining is sloughed off. So this picture is showing you basically the uterine cycle. So we just did the ovarian phase, now we have the uterine phase, or the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle starts with something called the menstrual phase. The menstrual phase starts the day 1 of menses, or the menstrual cycle. As soon as blood starts to flow from the vaginal canal, day 1 of menses, that's the menstrual phase. That lasts about 4 to 5 days. So the lining is being sloughed off because there was no pregnancy, and then we're going to start all over again. When it's ready to build back up again, the menses stops. And now we're in the proliferative phase. The proliferative phase means the functional endometrium starts to build up. The cells divide by mitosis, and we get thicker and thicker and thicker. All right, that lasts for until about day 12 or 13. Because what happens after that is ovulation. So what happens right prior to ovulation, and we start the secretory phase. With the secretory phase, now a lot of glands, all these showing all the glandular ducts right here. So not only is the lining thicker, but it comes real glandular, and it's producing glycogen, and which is going to be nutrients for the developing eggs, the developing fertilized egg that's going to become an embryo. Towards the end of the secretory phase, if there's been no implantation, the progesterone levels drop because the corpus luteum is dying. That dropping of the progesterone levels will start sloughing off this endometrial lining, which means we're going to start over with day 1 of the menstrual phase. All right, so there are 3 phases to the uterine cycle. There's the menstrual phase. Menstrual phase is days 1 through 5. As soon as there's any type of vaginal discharge or a bloody vaginal discharge, that starts the menstrual phase. That starts day 1. If you're counting the days in order to figure out which day you are ovulating, then you would start with day 1, the very first day that you have any type of spotting of blood. So that usually lasts around 5 days. Now this is just an average. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it is shorter. So that's day 1 through 5, the menstrual phase, as long as there is a discharge. After that is the proliferative phase, wherever we start building up the inner lining. Those are going to be days 6 through 14. After day 14, that is ovulation. And then we enter the secretory phase, where it becomes real glandular and produces layers and layers of glycogen. All right, that's the end of this chapter. So that's all I have for you for this lecture. I do wish that we could have had class and then we could discuss this. Maybe not face-to-face to discuss this chapter, because I do tend to get a little red in the face talking about reproduction. But anyway, that's just a personal thing. Anyway, email me if you have any questions. You already have the study guide, which is pretty thorough. And your exam will be on Tuesday, May 5th.